So that's questions. Yes.
So we are talking about all of this with a perspective of voting, that how a legislative can change these policies. What if we look at the same policies from a judicial point of view, where suppose passing of this law by the judiciary makes it mandatory for everyone to receive universal health care. So this insecurity that you're talking about, that probably the next generation that comes up might not prefer a welfare state. If the judiciary guarantees a welfare state, then that insecurity is dissolved, and perhaps then we can actually have the implementation of a welfare state.
Yeah, that's of course a very important question, and in some sense, let me sidestep it. But let me say this: that of course, there's always this democracy is not simple majoritarianism, right? So certain areas of policy or actions of the state are taken off the table. That is cannot be voted. Minority rights and so on, right? So putting certain fundamental rights in the Constitution would shield some of these things from democratic incentives, right? If there's a fundamental right to employment, for example, in the Constitution, then of course the question becomes moot. Then whether voters will accept or reject it doesn't become relevant, but then the question is, first, what are these things? What are these protections which are taken off the policy debate domain, of the campaign domain, and put in the Constitution? What should be sort of off limits like that? And also, how does it come about, right? I mean, at some point, maybe voters have to maybe participate in a referendum about this should be taken off the table or not. So that raises a lot of complex issues. Let me just say that we are interested in the story when the welfare state or the social insurance is not guaranteed by the Constitution. So it's very much in play, right? And that is often the case. I mean, there are lots of realistic examples, like the US healthcare example, where that's indeed the case. So those are the cases we are thinking about, right? Okay. So, but this is not a terribly interesting equilibrium, right? This is a stark possibility that can happen, and already you can see that there's no guarantee in this sort of repeated voting context that good things will come out of it, right? We may get pretty stuck in a bad set of policies. But let's give optimism a little try, right? So once again, A is the better policy. A is like, social insurance, welfare state. B is laissez-faire. Laissez-faire is not good because there are too many uninsured risks for individuals. Can we create equilibria where at least there's some chance that voters at some point will accept a welfare state, right? And the answer is yes. The answer is yes. There are other equilibria where that might happen. But this theorem gives us a complete description of these other equilibria, right? There's this pretty stark, dark, pessimistic world captured in this equilibrium. Good things never happen. This is the other set of possibilities. Good thing may happen, will eventually happen. But it's not going to happen easily, okay? So let me tell you what. So again, for majority voters, in the short run, in a single period, they lose from the good policy. In the long run, they gain. That's the setup. That's the assumption. Now, then we can construct a continuum of interior equilibrium given by these policy transition probabilities, QA, QB, where there is a fixed gap between the QA and the QB, right? The gap can be expressed as a function of the parameters of the model, right? Let me not get into that detail. But essentially, in all these equilibria, QA has to be bigger than QB. So the welfare state is going to be politically much more likely to be voted in favor of when we start with a welfare state, when we already have a welfare state. as opposed to when we start with laissez-faire. That is what this gap represents. And so therefore this gap is very much a measure of policy persistence. That if we have a welfare state, only a 10% chance tomorrow we'll vote it out. But if you have a laissez-faire system, there's only, there's a much, much higher chance that we won't accept a welfare state tomorrow. Now, why is that? Let me give you the intuition why that has to be the case for every equilibrium. Voters in state one have no short-term interest to adopt A. Employed people have no immediate stake in the welfare state. If anything, they'll pay a price if that is selected. So, for those guys, out of self-interest, to vote in favor of a welfare state, there has to be some compensating differential coming from the future. That they must be gaining something in the future in their minds why they'll go against their short-term self-interest, right? Now, if the two Qs were equal, there would be no such compensating differential. Tomorrow's voters don't pay any attention to what we did today. Their behavior is independent. Then why would I care? Let me vote against raising my taxes right now. However, if policies are sticky endogenously in equilibrium, in some sense, if tomorrow's voters are heavily influenced by the way we vote today, then that generates this incentive, that generates a compensating differential. Then, as a voter today, I think, oh, if we vote in a right-wing way and we throw out the proposed welfare state today, tomorrow's voters will be more likely to do the same, and then I'll be hurt if I lose my job tomorrow. And if it's sticky enough, then this compensating differential covers this fact that I'm voting against my short-term self-interest. It covers against the fact that V1 is negative, right? So this feature, policy persistence, makes policies endogenously sticky, and therefore incentivizes majority voters to support policies which are in the long term good for them. Now, as a matter of fact, there's many equilibria, there's a continuum of equilibria, right? But if we were to choose the best among them, right, the one which is best for the voters, often equilibria are Pareto ranked, right, in multiple equilibria model, and often we kind of pick the best one, right? So if we do that, then actually we get an extreme form of policy persistence. The best equilibrium is one where QA is not only higher than QB, QA is actually 1, and QB is some Q in the middle, right? So that means that once the welfare state is adopted, it never switches back. It stays there forever. Voters in future generations, in principle, could do a reversal, but they won't in equilibrium, right? It's kind of curious that if you think of the New Deal, right? Initially, there was a strong public healthcare component to the New Deal when FDR brought it, was trying to bring it to Congress, and then FDR dropped it, right? So there was this public pension, Social Security, and there was public universal healthcare, something like that, yeah. And FDR got afraid that the public healthcare part would be too much; it'll break it and it won't pass. So he dropped that. Yeah, in spirit, the Social Security, public pension, which they have, and public healthcare. I mean, in spirit they're similar, right? Both are sort of social insurance instruments. The Social Security has survived easily for the next almost 100 years. But over the same time, public healthcare was very, very hard to bring in. In fact, there was, during all these Tea Party movements, there was a little funny picture that some older American putting up a sign saying, "Government take your dirty hands off my social security. So this is a voter who didn't even realize social security is a government program. He thought it was some sort of market-given right to him. Yeah. Anyway, so I think at least anecdotally, there's a lot of, one can think of all kinds of examples of such stickiness. Anyway, welfare-wise, most important is, what's the welfare properties of these equilibria? Second result, equilibrium outcome is Pareto efficient in the class of Markovian policy choices. So let's think of a policy regime which is imposed by God, right? So let's think of all the kind of policies which have the following feature, that once the welfare state arrives, it will stay forever. Okay, that box is ticked. If we start with laissez-faire, there's a transition probability Q that in any one period will move to a welfare state, right? So you can vary Q, and it's a whole class of stochastic policy regimes, right? Each of them could be kind of raining from the sky, right? Now we can ask in equilibrium, a particular Q is chosen through electoral incentives. And we can ask the question that, could there be a different value of Q? Could there be a different transition probability which will make everyone healthy as well as sick, employed as well as unemployed, better off? And the answer to that is yes, right? And the answer to that is any Q higher than the equilibrium Q will have the feature that if God somehow chose it instead of voters, all voters will be better off in the process. So in equilibrium, let's say transition probability is 60%, then 70, 80, 90% all will be better if somehow those transition probability was raised through some means. Elections won't do it, but some other means doing it would be win-win. So why is that? Let me just give you a sense of the reasoning behind it. These are the long-term value functions as a function of Q. Okay. If Q is higher, so what's the red one? The red one is the unemployed people. Their value function, right? Their value function will be monotonically increasing in Q. Because they're unemployed, they have a short as well as a long-term stake in a welfare state, a redistributive state. They'll benefit immediately. So the greater the chance of that kind of policy being adopted right away, the greater is their overall welfare, right? So that is a monotonically increasing function. The blue curve is the curve, the lifetime payoff curve for people who currently have jobs. Now for those guys, increasing in Q, the adoption rate of a welfare state, is a mixed blessing, right? For them, there's a trade-off. Higher Q means their future is more secure. The welfare state arrives early. But higher Q also means that the current interests are more compromised because there's a bigger chance that they'll have to start paying these taxes right now when they hold jobs, right? So therefore, because of this trade-off, this is a single-peaked curve, right? These guys gain up to a point if the adoption rate increases, but beyond the point, their welfare goes down, okay? And what are the end values? The end values are those hats, right? If the probability of adoption was 1 right away, so essentially we are saying, we are adopting a welfare state right now, no ifs and buts, then whatever the lifetime payoffs are, those are the end values. Now, if the majority voters, people with jobs, if they're going to randomize, if they're going to have some chance of voting yes, some chance no to a welfare state, then the payoffs have to be equal, right? So if they voted for the welfare state for sure, right away, they would get exactly the same payoff that they're getting in equilibrium. So the equilibrium value of Q is determined by looking at the end point and extending it and see where else on this curve they get the same payoff. Yes? And you will see that it's on the rising part, right? So all these values of Q are inefficient values. If Q could be raised a little, then both types of voters would be better off. And the equilibrium value falls exactly in that zone. Yeah? So not only does this sort of gaming about voting and choosing social insurance versus not choosing social insurance, not only does it delay things, delay the adoption of good long-term policies, it delays it in a starkly inefficient manner, right? Lower delay would be win-win on all sides. Question? Let me show you a comparative static result, and then maybe I'll skip some of the details which come later and just start wrapping up. But anyway, let me talk about now. Two parameters which are of some importance are the P. Remember the P? P means people are moving between job and joblessness, health and sickness at a faster rate, right? So that's mobility, P. And the other is voter patience, delta. How much do voters discount the future? So, we have kind of found the equilibrium, and we can now, what happens to the equilibrium value of Q? Q is the rate of the adoption rate for welfare state starting from laissez-faire in equilibrium. So how is that affected by a change in any of these parameters? In particular, with respect to P, I think that's some relevant question that, in more mobile societies, do we expect social insurance and those kinds of policies to be adopted more easily, more quickly, or resisted more, right? Now, so when you look at the comparative static, you find that Q star, the adoption rate of welfare state, increases with an increase in voter patience. Now that part is not surprising at all. If voters are more forward-looking, they're more likely to adopt the welfare state, right? The resistance gets less because the future looms larger, as to be expected. The other one is more interesting. If P goes up, this is more mobility, then Q is higher. Let me reverse that. If P goes down, less mobility, right? Rich people have a smaller chance of becoming poor at any point in time. People with jobs have more secure, but by the same token, people without jobs find it difficult to get one, right? So economic fortunes in the natural environment are more sticky. If that happens and Q goes down, then the political resistance to redistribution also goes higher. So I think, again, one of the things which has happened, like lots of these empirical studies which look at mobility matrices, for example, right, or inequality, let's say for the US, it has been going up. I think it's fair to say that that's what people are finding in a lot of, or if you look at a cross-sectional comparisons, I mean, this is again a surprise. From all this American dream rhetoric, one would imagine that America is a society where rags to riches stories are more common, right? There's much more churning. If you can start at the bottom of the ladder, born to parents who are blue collar workers, you can become a millionaire. Yeah. In Europe, it's much more stratified, much more rigid. People don't move. Nonsense, right? Data shows mobility in America is lower, inequality is higher. So it's a myth, right? Now, when mobility is less, when it's difficult for people at the bottom of the ladder to climb to the top, then social insurance is more needed. It's more necessary to bridge these gaps which don't happen naturally, right? So what this is saying is that precisely when it's more needed, when it's more valuable, it'll be politically harder. Right? Now, why is that? The reason, again, is very, very simple. The fortunate, the rich, the people with jobs, for them to want to pay the taxes today by voting left, they have to have enough compensating differential, enough to gain in the future. When natural mobility is low, these guys are not very afraid that, oh, tomorrow I'll lose my job, because it happens at a very low rate. So that's why the need of the rich of social insurance, redistribution, all kinds of social safety nets becomes less, right? And that's why in equilibrium, the support for these things goes down.
Does this also relate to the interest of like rent seeking somehow?
Connect it to it? Help me connect it to it.
They also think that there is a persistence of rent seeking if there is rent seeking to start with. Works by Joseph Stiglitz, for example.
Yeah.
More or less like if there is a rent seeking,
Yeah.
then that will be difficult for the politicians to, and there will be a resistance to change that.
Yeah, here we are doing a little bit of a second order exercise, right? I mean, literally there's no rent seeking, but you may want to interpret maybe the gains and losses of the rich as something equivalent to rent seeking, right? But the question here is second order, which is that what is a change in rent seeking behavior when, you know, this or that changes? So in some sense, you know, when mobility, so in that, interpreted that way, when mobility is lower in the environment, that's when rent seeking goes up, quasi-rent seeking.
More or less the literature also.
I see, okay. So in that sense, there's an analogy there, okay. Yeah.
Funding won't it depend upon the proportion of rich people and poor people in the given demography? So if, for example, the rich are a tiny minority, it doesn't ultimately matter
Yeah.
what they think, right? And economic disparities, when it is higher, then the chances of the rich resisting policy changes may be higher, but there will be a greater desire for those who who are not rich to actually push through the policy.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do you factor in that?
Yes. Let me first give a quick mathematical answer to that. So the proportion of the rich in our model is captured by that X, right, which is sitting there behind the expressions. Remember? So the way we got here. So, you know, this is the transition matrix. If you're rich or with a job now, this is the jobless category. People are moving back and forth. Now, these probabilities are captured by two parameters. One is P, the other has this X. This X is essentially the fraction of the rich in this society at any given point in time, right? It's kind of, now, so we can ask the question exactly, you know, what if there are more rich people in this society? That would be basically saying, okay, what happens to everything when this X goes up, right? But this exercise which I just showed you is, let's hold the fraction of the rich at some number. Let's say 70% are rich. But even then, this churning can go up or down, right? You can have a society where 70% who are rich are always rich till the end of time. Another where it's a lot of musical chairs going on. The rich are slipping down and the poor are moving up, but at any given point in time it's 70-30, right? So the result is with respect to this churning rate changing, given 70% rich. Now, you also said, if the rich are a minority, that would mean X is less than half. So then it's the other group who's voting. It's the voting behavior of the poor, right? In the story I'm telling, let's say I'm assuming the rich are a majority, right? If you apply it to the kind of American examples I was talking about, let's say health insurance, 85% have health insurance, right? So in a lot of those applications, it is quite clear that the fortunate category are really more than 50%. I think this sort of story would be, and this people sometimes ask me when I present this, I think this particular story is less relevant in the Indian context when we are talking of our early welfare state, because the poor are they are the majority. This cute game theoretic problem doesn't even get off the ground, right? So if we are puzzling over why our politicians and our system is not, let's say with health and education, right, a perennial thing that keeps getting neglected. Whatever be the reason, I don't think this paper throws much light on it, right? But I think it's relevant for India, in my thinking at least, going into the future. Once we develop a healthy middle class, we'll have to solve some of these problems. And that's when these things will kick in. And so that's why I think it's also it's probably helpful when the poor are a majority to lay the foundations for a lot of these things. Because once we get to a fat middle class, then it'll be hard. Okay, I'm sure people are tired. What am I doing? So there's more stuff, but I don't want to. Oh, let me come back to this slide, which I skipped. How much time do I have?
Can take about 10 minutes.
Okay. Yeah. So I think this story, this theory, this model has a strong Rawlsian flavor. I'm sure you're kind of detecting it, right? So Rawls's idea of what is a just society. Well, imagine we haven't been born yet. We don't know whether we're going to be born in a slum or whether in the home of a millionaire, whether we'll be healthy or I'll have some disability. I don't know. We're all sitting behind a veil. Lottery of birth hasn't yet happened. And if we could make a social contract at that point about what kind of social system we want to have, most of us would probably strongly favor an egalitarian society, a society which takes resources from the more fortunate and gives to the less fortunate. Unfortunately, of course, once we are born and learn, we probably don't have any motive to stick to that hypothetical arrangement unless it becomes some sort of basis for an ethical stance, right? So Rawls is saying we should act as if we are sitting behind this veil of ignorance and so on. So several things about it, which is, one is that, people make a social contract behind a veil of ignorance. This notion of Rawlsian voting or choosing or social contracting is all ex ante, entirely ex ante. Before we learn anything about our lives, what would we want to do? And the lifting of the veil happens only once. So it's like, the birth is the major event when unknowns get realized. And the construction is imaginary. This is a purely normative theory, right? Of course, there's no voting behind the veil of ignorance, right? Now, in this framework which I've laid out for you, people make a series of social contracts. Each vote is a new contracting which will only last for a few years. The voting happens ex ante as well as ex post, right? So when I'm voting today, certain things have already happened. I know whether right now how I'm doing, whether I'm healthy or whether I have a job or not. So in that sense, it's ex post. But part of it is also, what will happen in the future and how will, as a society, what kind of system we'll have. So that's ex ante. And I wanted to call the paper The Dance of the Seven Veils, but my co-author, it wasn't even voting, it was complete coercion. So the veils keep getting removed, keep getting removed, keep getting removed, right? So birth is not the only stochastic event. Throughout life, we face stochastic events which can dramatically alter where we are. And the construction is literal. This is a positive theory. Unlike Rawls's theory, this is primarily a positive theory of political economy and voting and so on. Yeah. Yeah. So there are similarities, there are differences. There's a strong Rawlsian flavor to what we are doing. Okay, moving forward, let me try and wrap it up now. Let me just very briefly tell you what are the other kind of things that we were doing in the paper beyond this baseline benchmark model. One of the things we can talk about is winners compensating losers. So let's say utility is transferable. So remember that V1, V2. So we can change that short-term payoff matrix by taking some amount from the V1 and transferring it to the V2, right? If you're thinking of, let's say, social insurance, then the transfer actually amounts to a less of a transfer, right? So if you have full income insurance, then the poor gain a lot and the rich give up a lot in money as well as utility. What if we make these transfers smaller? In other words, we make it a soft welfare state, not a hard welfare state, right? Volume of redistribution is lowered. This result says it's going to be better for everyone. Yes? Now, of course, we are giving up on some potential benefit here. Redistribution is less, compression is less, so some insurance benefit is lost. The advantage is political. The speed of adoption goes up. Voters are more likely to accept this imperfect welfare state instead of a perfect welfare state with full redistribution. And what we show is that even for the poor, this is going to be better. Right? So this proposition is somewhat of it has a flavor of, an endorsement for political pragmatism. Don't shoot for the ideal best thing. Reach for something which is imperfect, but which has a better chance of passing, right? So you can show that, that works. Another result we have is about the timing of elections. So we assumed every period in this model elections will happen, but you can say, well, every 3 periods, 5 periods, 10 periods. Yeah. Now, if that was a policy variable or a constitutional choice, right, how often elections, then we can raise the question, what is the optimal length? Well, under certain assumptions, so let me just point out that there's a trade-off. If you have elections less often, it has a plus, it has a minus. The minus is that if we make a mistake, we are stuck with it for a very long time. The plus is that it changes the incentives of the voters in a good way, right? If every mistake is going to last for a long time, then voters would like to adopt good systems more. If every year we are voting for or against a welfare state, then if I have a job and I'm healthy today, I'll say, I'll just have to survive a year. After that, we'll have a vote again. So let me keep my taxes low for this year, right? If the next vote is going to come 20 years later, then I'll say, 20 years, a lot of things can happen. I can really run into a lot of trouble. Let me vote for a more egalitarian system right now. So what we show is that, under certain assumptions, it doesn't always happen. For example, when the shocks are IID, you can show that spacing out elections as much as possible is a good thing, right? Okay, and then we do a bunch of stuff. let me skip all of this. So we extend it to representative democracy, where voters are not directly making ballot choices. Policy is chosen by candidates, like Hotelling Downs kind of candidates. We extend it to a continuum of policies, not just two policies. And the basic flavor of the results are the same. That's the bottom line. So let me wrap up. The main idea here is that democracies lack policy commitment. We can't commit to policies over a very long horizon. We can only commit to it for like 4 years, 5 year cycles. Now, a lot of very critical economic policies to do with things like social insurance they're not short-term policies. Their effects on individuals arise from how they play out over a lifetime, right? So many such policies drive a wedge between the short and the long-term interests of voters. In the short term, I want to go very right-wing. In the long term, I may want to go much more left-wing. So how do I vote in today's election, right? That's what creates all this gaming, this tragedy, whatever you want to call it, and it gives rise to phenomena like policy uncertainty, delay, and inefficiencies. One way in which the electoral system tries to counteract this is by creating policy persistence. That if there emerges a sense that voting behavior is very sticky, that if voters are being left-wing today, they're more likely to be left-wing tomorrow than if they were right-wing today. If that sort of stickiness becomes an expected feature of the political system and voting behavior, it will be self-fulfilling, right? It will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that's the only way in which things like social insurance can be adopted by voters through this sequence of short-term votes. Ultimately, if you want to sort of remove these inefficiencies, it has to be constitutional solutions. There was a question about, and maybe one can, there's no sort of well fleshed out message that we have over there, but the Constitution, this being careful about the length of the cycle, electoral cycle, that's possibly one policy instrument, right? Where this suggests that spacing it out is a good thing, right? Okay. Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, so in this framework, if suppose you have the number of rich people are less, so I'm talking about a country suppose like ours.
Yeah.
So here it would be difficult to have an equilibrium where you have
Where all this funky stuff is going on, it won't happen.
But I'm just wondering, would it be possible to generate something on the opposite direction, like survival on an equilibrium with a QB, for example, becoming equal to 1? If there is some sort of, every period there is the aggregate X actually is going up here the X is the same, right?
Yeah.
So suppose X is very less, but it is going up, which means that if you are poor, there is a good chance that the next stage, your probability of becoming rich goes up. Will there be any possibility of generating equilibrium that QB actually becomes rich?
See, one thing technically is that if you start with the composition of rich and poor in general, take that transition matrix as given, right? At what rate rich become poor and poor become rich, at what rate healthy people fall sick and sick people recover. Suppose that's a given, right, for individuals. And then you ask the question, what's the composition of rich and poor? Now, that'll have a dynamics, right? You start with 60% rich and it goes up to 65 and then to 68 and so on. But for any given transition rates, it will always go to an invariant distribution, some steady state, right? So technically speaking, it's very hard to analyze this sort of thing when it's out of steady state. So that's an assumption I impose at the beginning, which is that let's suppose this rich-poor business has settled down, the dust has settled. So now we are having the economy is kind of replicating the same fraction of rich and poor every period. And starting from this point, what are the political incentives, etc., what will come out of voting behavior, etc., right? So pose the question when the composition of rich and poor hasn't yet stabilized, maybe a growing economy, something. It's the economy itself is evolving very quickly. I mean, you can pose the same questions, but you have to handle this out of steady state behavior. Now, having said that, adopting social insurance when the poor are a majority shouldn't be hard. Because the poor are a majority today the game, tomorrow the game, day after tomorrow the game. If money is taken from the rich and given to the poor. Right? There's no tension that, yeah.
But I'm wondering if the opposite, is it possible that you have an equilibrium where the poor are in the majority, but they're actually choosing less than?
It probably happens in the real world, and that goes back to all these, views of Thomas Frank and all that, somehow false consciousness, poor have been brainwashed. We don't have anything in our model, in our theoretical framework to generate that, right? Which is not to say that that doesn't happen in the world. There are other reasons, but it won't happen here.
So this model starts with that steady state assumption.
As to the composition of rich and poor, healthy and sick, right? That itself has some potential dynamics which we take out.
But sir, I feel whether we have the poor at a minority or a majority, the weightage that we generally assign, like realistically speaking at least, the weightage that we give a rich person as opposed to a poor person is way higher. So whether the poor people...
We meaning who?
Like generally the political atmosphere,
okay.
I mean when you see the lobby groups, etc.
Yeah.
In a lot of when you take legislative decisions, we see that the lobbyists are very powerful.
Right.
And then in that respect, even if the majority of the population is poor and the weightage that the rich get is higher,
Yeah.
then can we really use this theoretical framework to...
No, because see, we have made assumptions where we have kept out a lot of these usual suspects from the stage, right? No lobbyists, not even any politicians. Many of these, if you will, conspiracy theories, right? I think a lot of them are true. I have some other papers where the role of the media, etc. All of this comes in, right? So there the voter doesn't have a clean way of exerting his or her will on the system because there are these other players who are always subverting it. But we have kept all of that out, right? So when we get a very negative result with very conservative assumptions, right? Very favorable assumptions about the political system, right? And then we say, oh, things can go wrong in a spectacular way. That's a very cautionary kind of tale, right? So that means we don't even need our lobbyists and our big industrialists and whatever, in America they talk about the HMOs and so on, right? Those are very much part of the public discourse about why it's so hard to get reform in healthcare. And I'm pretty sure that all these lobbies and all, they play their roles. But if there's a deeper force which will still interrupt this process of adopting the right kind of health insurance system, then there's a deeper cause for concern. Then part of the reason is in the democratic forces themselves.
What is the empirical implications, for example?
How we test this?
Yeah.
As is, so for example, take the result on mobility. Mobility is something which you can measure and calibrate. So that would be in principle testable. Of course, all of these things are very, there's a lot of hoops you have to pass through if you're taking into data. But I would say that would be a promising lead for a testable implication. That more mobile economic environments, resistance to social insurance would be stifled. Thank you.
ठीक हैप्पी ले लो